This video is about single mothers and what men need to know about them before they get into a relationship with them. I had a friend who told me that he once dated an older woman who was a single mom. Soon after, she started talking about marriage, which eventually led her to asking him that if they do get married, he'll have to adopt her son and provide for him as well as her for the rest of their lives, even if he barely knew her. Fortunately, my friend completely saw through that and ended the relationship. However, most men don't, and they realize too late how they'd been pushed into something that the mother had planned all along. And if they do, they get criticized by society for leaving a good woman alone and not helping her through her struggling life. He also talked about how women from the deep rural West were very different from those who live in the city. They tend to marry young because they need company, and also children to eventually help them look after the farm. The rural life keeps them isolated, so they don't care about themselves like women do in the urban areas. Hence, they become very overweight and expect men to provide for them throughout their lives. The ones who get divorces tend to move to urban cities where they struggle to find men to date. And the ones who do date them are expected to marry them and adopt their children as well. So I applaud my friend who rejected the single mother, because he then would have been forced to look after a woman who's had her fair share of lovers in the past and would have been asked to take care of a child that wasn't his. For the woman, it would have been a big score if he had agreed to her terms. The women had probably moved to the city for a lack of luck in finding a wealthy farmer or rancher's young son, willing to take the role of a husband and father for an overweight woman. Female empowerment has led to a steady rise in urban populations. As women start to move away from rural areas to the cities in order to be independent, they also sometimes move with their children that they've had from their previous marriages. In rural areas, men work hard on their farms and ranches so they don't have time to play women's mind games and be manipulated all the time. Women tend to move to the cities so that they can live and work independently, chasing the feminist narrative of being strong, successful, and independent women. Back in the day, men moved from rural areas to the cities to work on factories and earn a living they couldn't find in rural areas. In those days, women also moved to urban areas so they could also find work and men working in factories that allowed them to live a better life than they would in rural areas. Today, things have changed. Today, people are moving from crowded cities and settling down in rural or isolated areas where they can afford better housing and live in more spacious houses. After the pandemic, especially when working remote became a normal thing to do, many have already moved back to rural areas with basic internet connections and the availability to electricity in order to live more peaceful lives. They've done this to reduce their costs of living, such as utilities, transport, and be safe from viral pandemics such as COVID-19, which are far more likely to have outbreaks in crowded cities. So now it is easier for single mothers from rural areas to target men who have moved to rural areas in search for a more peaceful living. This is where men will need to stay vigilant and not be manipulated into marriage with these women, because they will come on strong and push for marriage and the adoption of their children. If we look at relationships closely, they are all about power struggles. Women tend to use the notions of love to keep men in their control. Having kids with these women allow them to use men's resources more openly and to their advantage. And women are very shady when it comes to their resources. I have yet to meet a woman who is generous with what she earns or has inherited. And yet, they expect men to work hard all their lives and just hand over the money to these women who only occasionally spread their legs apart for them in order to keep these men hooked to them. Men are now realizing this and not giving in to this manipulation as much as they used to in the past. Men have had enough of the tests and the games and have been burnt far too often to know what women truly want. Yet there are men who still fall for this, and which is why women still continue doing this even today. Simps who don't have a strong willpower are easily seduced because women find out their weaknesses and exploit them. A woman who's really great in bed will always be a weakness for weak men. Men need to realize that the hour of pleasure they have in the bedroom is not unconditional. The women you're dating or are supposed to marry is only doing that so she can get your resources in the long term to finance her life and fuel her material and societal wants. She's using you for social value of being married to someone stable, to make a network of friends or potential future suitable partners in case this goes wrong, and to have access to funds that allows her decent food, designer handbags, and vehicles. Also, men in rural areas might be strong physically, but they are not as intellectually refined as men in the cities. This is probably why rural men fall for rural women all the time in their early years and get into marriage and have kids, only to go for a divorce when they later find out the manipulative side of women. Men in cities who move to rural areas know better, and that is why women go for such guys in the first place, because they know if they manipulate them once, then they're probably intellectually superior to those men, and then they can push them towards marriage and a stable life with someone earning from a city job that pays much more than someone working in a farm. For such men, what starts as a simple move to the rural areas in search of some peace and quiet turns into a marriage that swiftly becomes a case of adoption, of them having to share their resources with a single rural mother, and eventually divorce. Women are known to live and thrive in packs, so even if rural women who move to the city get in a relationship with men, they eventually try to persuade them to move back to their rural areas so that the women can be closer to their circle and community of women. That makes it easier for the women to manipulate and control their men when they have their tribe of single mothers around them to constantly tell them what to do next. They can then also be closer to their own families, where they can use their influence in the area through their brothers and fathers. Women from the country and rural areas are somehow easier to get along with. They don't have the tendency to be shrewd as most city women do. Hence, guys usually find it easier to talk to and be with women from the country. But you can't take the female nature out of them. They might seem like the long-term commitment sort, but they use that to eventually manipulate men the same way a woman from the city would, even before marriage. That's also because rural girls aren't as educated as girls from the city. This is why country girls seem much simpler, easier to understand and get along with. Country girls don't commonly go to universities to get their masters of PhDs. That's something that's fairly common with city girls. Also, going back a couple of decades, women in rural areas didn't have satellite television or even an internet connection. Their access to popular culture was much less than it is today. This meant that they were less influenced by other women or shows that gave women the knowledge to manipulate men for their own wishes. Also, religion was a lot more prevalent in rural areas when compared to cities, so they had all the more reason to settle down early in life, get married, and have children. Another important point is that women can have a bigger social circle when they're married. Single women don't hang around married women. Married women don't hang around with single women because they're scared they'll seduce their husbands. And when single women look at single mothers, it scares them and pushes them to not have kids because they don't want to give up their lives and have that sort of responsibility on their shoulders. In the city, things are a little different. For example, a single woman with children will have a harder time bonding with other single women without children because she won't have that much time on her hands as them. Although in the cities, these social norms are not as rigid as they are in the rural areas. Married couples will still hang out with single men and women, and vice versa. Single women are afraid of becoming single mothers in the cities because that will devastate their social lives, which is something that women base their self-esteem on most of the time. Single mothers in rural areas are shunned in their communities, so they move to the big cities. That's just a dynamic that has been at play since the last decade. Gentlemen, I hope you understand these dynamics before you venture into a relationship with a country girl. I hope you understand these factors when your woman pushes you to move from the city to her farm in Utah. Thanks for tuning in.